So they say that garden trends are a lot like diet trends. They're here one day and gone the next. In today's episode, we're gonna talk all about garden trends because I've seen a lot of them throughout the years and kind of some of the pros and cons about them and where they are today. Now, I will say that I don't want to be on the record as saying that garden trends are a bad thing. I think that gardening is a great thing, and anytime someone can be growing food, taking charge of where their food comes from, that's a positive thing. That's a huge thing. So I know that a lot of people tend to think that a fad is a bad thing, but this is just, kind of highlighting some of the things that we come across in the gardening community that may not be the most timeless type gardening style, right? They might be a little bit gimmicky, yes. They might be a little bit funny, but they're a gardening style nonetheless. And so much like a diet, sometimes they're longer lived than others. I think the first garden trend that we all know about that we can relate to is the square foot gardening method. Now, Mel Bartholomew started this method, and it was based off of a grid gardening method. Basically, on a 4x4 garden was 16 square feet. And essentially in that 16 square feet could show you just how much you could grow. And this method absolutely took the gardening world by storm because it really challenged a lot of the traditional spacing techniques that farmers were implementing in their home gardens. Now, one thing that I love about square foot gardening is the fact that it's a really great way to showcase just how much food can be grown in a small area. I think that anytime we can grow more food in less space, that's a positive thing on all levels, right? Not even just the home garden. I think a lot of this stuff could be scaled up to large commercial farms as well, where they could be growing twice as much, 3 times as much food in the same amount of space. I think that is a huge positive takeaway. Now, there's one negative to the square foot gardening method, and that's that the whole idea behind square foot gardening is very limiting on the overall scale of the garden. I can't tell you how many people only put in 4x4 beds, and they just put in a bunch of them, which isn't necessarily a problem, but what I have found is that if you apply the 4x4 grid method to a larger scale garden, you're gonna actually have a better yield. And the reason why is because something like a tomato, for instance, I can throw a tomato on the edge here and grow out the rest of my 48 square feet in my garden. Whereas in a square foot gardening method, those 2 tomato plants might take up about half that raised bed. And that's not always the most useful for space. So in my beds here, I'm growing very much in kind of an adapted version of the square foot garden method, but I'm growing so much more food than in a square foot garden because my beds are a little bit longer and I'm utilizing my space a little bit more effectively than in a perfect grid setting. Now, where's the square foot gardening method today? Well, it's still around. I don't think it's quite as popular as it has been in the past. To new gardeners, they find it really easily. I think a lot of times, anytime you're looking for beginning gardening methods, it's one that is really promoted to the beginning gardener. But because a lot of us have already started our gardens and there's less beginning gardeners now than there were a couple years ago, during a few years that we we never remember, those years really brought about a lot of new gardeners. And once you become a gardener, it's a great method to get you started, but over time you adapt it like we have, and we no longer really use it. So it's still around, it's very popular still, and I think it's still a wonderful method for beginning gardeners because it teaches those principles about intensive gardening and kind of the idea of home gardening, which is wonderful, but I just don't think it's quite as popular as it was. And I don't think it's a fad necessarily. I think it's around to stay. I think that, say, 10, 15 years ago, it was a bit of a fad because that's all you saw. Now, the next gardening fad is aquaponics. I know a lot of you are going to say, well, Luke, aquaponics is a very popular gardening method and one that I don't think is a fad at all, but I do think is a fad, and I'll explain why. So for this video, I'm classifying a fad as anything that was very important to the agricultural industry, but is made available, widely available to the home garden in kind of a not cost-effective, kind of gimmicky way, just for clarification. So about 5-7 years ago, you saw a lot of aquaponic setups being sold to the home gardener, from things like grow lettuce with a betta fish or grow, a bunch of herbs with some goldfish. And we did try a couple, to be honest. Back in the day, we tried a couple. So I'm not saying that I was immune to the fad because they were fun and they were made accessible and they were very trendy, which was interesting from a gardening content perspective wise. I wanted to showcase what was popular, obviously, but looking back, it was very much a blip in the gardening life cycle of products because it was not timeless whatsoever. Now, there are a lot of people that still use aquaponic methods, but they're on a much larger, more efficient scale. And I think what this really intended for was, it was more for kids to think, oh, that's a cool product. And it was sold to parents as an idea for them to kind of involve their kids in gardening, which isn't a wrong thing. Again, I go back to what I said. It's not wrong to get people excited about gardening, but they would cost like $150 to $200, and you'd grow like one head of lettuce. The cost to return value was set up such that it was doomed to fail from the beginning. On top of all of that, you had the dependence on artificial lighting. So something like hydroponics is a much more cost-effective indoor method, and one that I don't think is a fad, and I think will be around with us for the foreseeable future. And I also think that you had a lot of components of indoor gardening, as well as hydroponics and stuff, kind of converging with this more sustainable method of growing fish and growing plants. But the fish you were growing were like literal pets, like betta fish and goldfish. You're not going to consume those like you would a tilapia, right? So, or like a perch, right? You're not going to. It's not an apples to apples gardening method at all, and it was intended for the home garden, and it was definitely a fad in my opinion. All right, now the next gardening fad is very similar to the aquaponics fad, and that's the AeroGarden fad. Now, looking at you, AeroGarden, nothing against the AeroGarden. If you're really looking at just growing food throughout winter and you want something to kind of scratch that itch, right, for the gardening bug, it's wonderful. But again, I kind of consider a fad as anything that is something that is important to the agricultural industry, but is not quite applicable to the home garden, but it's marketed as such. That's kind of what I consider to be a fad, because they're not going to last very long. I know the AeroGardens are still around today, and I know a lot of people grow with them. And I've grown with them in the past as well. So again, I'm not immune to this fad. But what I found through my experience is that you would spend $175 on a setup, and then you have these little cartridges, and then there was this food that went into the system, and the lights had a life expectancy, and you could only grow on like a kitchen countertop, so you could only grow like 4 heads of lettuce, or 4 or 6 sets of herbs, stuff like that. And it was costing you $200, and these little cartridges were basically the equivalent of a printer, right? The printer's super cheap, the cartridges are really expensive, and it's this kind of reoccurring revenue stream for the AeroGarden manufacturers that once they've got you and you've got the system, it's like now you're kind of on the hook, and we've got you. And that's what I think was doomed to fail from the beginning, is much like the aquaponics setups, they were far too expensive for most people to justify, and the cost to reward ratio never lined up. And I've always said that a gardening method that is timeless and one that everyone can utilize, that is not a fad, is going to be something that is going to be not only cost effective, but return effective as well, right? There's a balance. There should be a net reward at the end, because you're putting in time and resources into growing those plants. Anything where it's going to cost you more than you're going to get out of it, it's not going to last very long, because at a certain point, a person is going to say, well, I could just go to a farmer's market, or I could just go to a grocery store, if it's really about growing food. If it's about entertainment value, there will always be a market there, because entertainment is worth something to someone, but it's going to be a much smaller market, hence a fad, than what it was about, I'd say, about 5 to 7 years ago. All right, the next gardening fad that I think a lot of you probably have seen or heard about, and is definitely still around today, but is not quite as popular as it was, I'd say, about maybe 10, 15 years ago when I first started gardening, was the recycled gardening trend. Now, this is a fad for sure, because so many of these things that were being sold as an idea to the home gardener were ideas that were just flat out silly. It really took recycling to the next level, and I think recycling is a good idea, right? I think that reducing, reusing, and recycling is always a good method rather than taking it to the landfill. But some stuff is just not practical if you're going to take gardening really seriously and have a lot of success. I'll explain what I mean. So when it came to recycled gardening, there were so many people that would talk about using things like old tires, right? Growing old tires because they make a wonderful raised bed. Well, we found out really quickly that, yeah, you know, tires are a big waste product, but they're not very good for growing edible food in because they leach so many heavy metals and things and petroleum products into the soil, which then just taints your food. So not a great idea there. But then there was also people that would go to the, what I consider the end extreme of recycling, where it's like every little plastic container, every little tub of something could be reused. And it was just, you became a literal hoarder for gardening, which again, maybe for some people isn't a bad thing. But I think for the large majority of people that thought, oh, that's a good idea. It was a good idea for a year, and then they realized just how much stuff they amassed, and then it became impractical because the average person doesn't want to hold on to 3,000 yogurt containers. It's just not practical after a certain point. And you'd have people that are like, oh, we'll save them and then give them to somebody else. And then it's like, I don't want your used yogurt containers. Like, I'll use my own. And then it just became this endless spiral of reusing all of this stuff that then even the second year after you used that yogurt container, you've got even more yogurt containers, and there's only so many yogurt containers you need, or like fruit containers for sprouting seedlings, or egg cartons for starting seedlings. All are good and all can work, but it was the level at which they were being used where it was like, that was the only thing being talked about for a solid year. I remember it, and it was crazy. And then the next year after that, radio silence. You might have heard little whisperings throughout the gardening community about using things like yogurt cups, but it would, I kind of consider it like the forest fire effect. It burns through super fast and there's nothing left to burn. It just burns all the material. Everyone had already talked about it, and so there wasn't a whole lot more room for it to take traction. So it does kind of still exist, obviously, today, and I think it's a good idea to reduce, reuse, and recycle. But the level at which people recycled gardening was crazy, and I think it was a bit of a fad. So if you've heard of some of these garden trends and fads, I know that I barely scratched the surface for the ones that have existed over the years. And like I said, I've been around the gardening community for quite some time, ever since I've been a kid. And I've seen a lot of these trends and fads come about. And there's a ton more that I haven't even talked about, but we just don't have time for. So if you know of some funny trends or fads in the comments box down below, let me know. I'd love to hear some of the funny ones that you've seen over the years. And also, you know, I will just kind of end on the fact that, again, I want to reiterate that fads are not necessarily a bad thing. I know that people might think that they are a bad thing because they might have a negative connotation, but anytime you're growing food, that is a positive thing. And as we mature and grow as gardeners, we realize the timeless things that stick. And it might be a trend or a fad that gets someone into gardening. So I by no means want to say that trends or fads should be eliminated and we should only garden with one method, because I have said, and I will say even in this video, the gardening is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And what works for you might not work for me, and what works for me might not work for you. But that doesn't mean that everyone is going to, follow these trends, right? It's a little bit of popcorn, right? They might stick around, they might stay. Doesn't mean they're the worst thing in the world. Doesn't mean they're that bad. But it just might mean that they are not quite as popular as they were when they first started. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all found this kind of light, fun, and entertaining. If you did enjoy, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll catch you all on the next episode. Take care. Grow bigger. Bye.